Okay, now comes the core topic of the Media and Brain lecture series on artificial consciousness. We will have a look at models. Artificial consciousness. Apparently, this is only a brief overview of what is possible in the area of artificial consciousness, because for Media and Brain 1 there is already a seminar task in which you should compare all of those models, or the vast majority of those, in particular the global workspace theory, which we are going to mention in a minute briefly, the model of Jella and Manzotti, and many other models. So we won't do that here. What I will point out is what, in my opinion, the major functions of such a model would be. That is very much based on the notion of Jella, which is also the paper which is also linked in the forum. And our idea that we developed over the last 2 years of how to implement actually free will plus the idea generation part, so the goal setting and to a degree the self-motivation. Now then, models of artificial consciousness. The most famous one, I believe, is the model of bars, which was also operationalized by Shanahan. This is known as the global workspace theory. The model itself is very simple. It says that you have perceptual input. Watch the video on perception and psychophysics in order to understand what it might be. On the other end, you apparently have to interact with the world that you do over your actions. And in between the two is the global workspace. In the global workspace, you have working memory as one component, so you need a way to remember and to retrieve what you already learned about the world. You have to compare what comes in to the norms of your behavior. Norm is not just meant in a moral sense, but all sorts of behavior, social norms, but also statistical norms, I believe mostly actually, to judge a situation correctly and in a sane way. You have to do parallel processing of different stimuli and integrate them, and many other functions more. The fundamental idea is, I think, also apparent, that the flow of information goes through here and here and goes to the output. And at the center we have this function, which we don't yet understand. That is the global workspace. One other theory that I would like to briefly mention is called the standard model of mind. If I remember correctly, that was defined by Laird. It is a bit more complex than the global workspace. At the center you have the memory, the so-called working memory, which is triggered by perception and creates motor output. Well, that we understood when we spoke about perception already. And it communicates with the so-called long-term memory, which according to Laird's understanding is mostly procedural. We have generally two types of memory: declarative, so this is knowledge, and procedural, this is behavior. Okay, so if we have a long-term memory, it's either declarative or procedural. These are two models that are quite famous and often cited: the Bars model and the LARD model. Before we come to a model based on the ideas of Jella and Mazzotti, I would like to say a few things in particular about the standard model. One is, or the most important problem that I have with this model, is that it considers memory to be a unit. A unit in the brain is often perceived as a center, so as a specific spatial location in the brain. And that, I believe, cannot be. We have learned in the video on the neuron that each individual neuron holds information, performs semantic enrichment, retrieves something. What does it retrieve? It retrieves the information stored in the weight and the threshold and in the type of synapses. All that is information that we store. We don't know, that is admitted, how in detail these connections are actually formed. The most important part, by the way, of the semantics is actually the connection of certain neurons. So the topology of the net itself is knowledge, and that is per se distributed, of course, over the entirety of the brain, in particular of the cortex and the subcortical regions. So if we have that knowledge everywhere, and propagating the information means that we retrieve the knowledge stored in the individual node at every single location, then apparently there cannot be a center that is memory, but the entire brain is memory. Every act of semantic enrichment is an act of retrieval, and retrieval of what? Of memory, apparently. So these models that state explicitly a memory, in my opinion, hinder us to a degree to understand what artificial and consciousness in general, we might actually put brackets around that, actually is or must be based on the evidence that we have. The memory is, yes, the center of the concept, but no, not as a center, but as the fundamental area where we aggregate the semantics and where we retrieve the semantic understanding of the world that we have. In that respect, I'm rather on the side of Bars, where we have this big undescribed structure, which is the global workspace, and that is an aggregate of neurons, apparently, and each of those neurons holds memory. So this is my main criticism. It is a criticism that comes, of course, from all sides and many experts in the domain as well. And since models like the standard model and the global workspace are manifold, at least I know at least 10 of those models, and there are certainly way more. I usually refer to these days as box and arrow models because they are very nice for giving you a general overview of the ingredients and their relationships, but they actually are not potent to explain anything in the course of consciousness. We, however, in our course, and I would like to emphasize that, we want to identify how artificial consciousness might work based on just two ingredients, the one being the neuron and the other one being the evolution. So we are looking for a really generative model that is at the focus of what we are doing in this course. Such a concept of memory would be hard to describe in terms of neurons. The global workspace is partially hard to describe in terms of evolution. Therefore, we go for a different model. But before we do that, let's maybe spend a few minutes thinking about what consciousness might actually be. Well, since we have no presence lecture this year, we cannot do a brainstorming session, but I will name some of the concepts that were named last year, in the year 2019, when we spoke together about what consciousness might actually be. Some students came up with emotions. If I can remember correctly, that was actually the first word that was said. Another word that was mentioned was imagination. Imagination holds two concepts. First, to recognize something as a symbol or as an object of our thinking, and then also to extrapolate it into the future. Another word that was mentioned was attention. So we are not just attentive to our environment, but we might also be able to focus on particular aspects of our work. We might actually lose attention sometimes when we are working very hard on a problem and entering a stage of so-called flow. One thing that I added, because it didn't come up, was inner speech. Inner speech is also sometimes referred to as the inner monitor. When I think about something, about a dialogue, for example, with a person I know, then I actually hear myself talking, and I've heard that other people's experience the same. When I think of a person, I might see the person's shape, face, or even the way this person walks, which might be typical biometrically. Another thing that was also mentioned was that memory, to have a past, very often thought in procedural ways, is an important ingredient to consciousness. Another thing that was added was the perception of others. And one person said social norms. Okay, we could go on filling this piece of paper with further things that are at least related to what consciousness is. But let's rather conclude on what we have here. So this is the term, and this term consciousness is apparently only loosely defined. We don't really know what is part of our consciousness. What we do know is that we have one, but we don't know what all makes part of it. One thing that is, I think, firmly established these days is that the inner monitor is certainly an important ingredient. If I think, I perceive myself thinking, and that influences the way I see the world. So, another important ingredient is certainly attention. Attention, being able to focus, being able to set goals, being able to motivate myself. All that would not be possible, apparently, without memory. However, the memory is necessary for the conscious as well as for the unconscious behavior. Memory in terms of norms or even stored procedures. Central pattern generators, we call them in the lecture part on the psychophysics, is the necessary ingredient for all behavior, for all participation in the world, for all understanding of the world. So it is, of course, central to consciousness, but it is also central to other aspects. It is the neuron itself. Okay, emotions and consciousness, I'm not perfectly sure, I must say. I rather see the emotions as an effect with the feedback loop of the conscious system. So what triggers consciousness in the subcortical regions also triggers emotions. And these emotions might then influence our consciousness. The consciousness, on the other hand, might also be able to influence our emotion. If something bad happens to me, I might lose a close relative, for example, then I feel very strong emotions. but to a degree I'm able to control these emotions through my consciousness by focusing my attention on the good times that we had, for example, and being grateful for those instead of being sad. Social norms is, in my opinion, just another word for a very specific type of memory. So this is procedural knowledge, no doubt about that, and it's very important procedural knowledge. It's passed on from generation to generation, so it's part of our culture also. There's a lot of very intriguing research in the area of sociology and psychology, what our social norms are, how they are stored, how they are misinterpreted, and so on. Yet, I would not say that this is actually a real constituent of the consciousness process. On the other hand, very important, I believe, is the perception of others, and so says the literature, because only if we have a theory of mind of other people, as it is often referred to, are we able to actually interact with them. That's why the theory of mind is also an individual topic for the seminar, in order to give us all the knowledge that we have based on the world descriptions of how this could actually be implemented. Imagination is a very important planning tool. It's certainly also a part of our consciousness. And we are not the same in terms of imagination. Some of us have more imaginations, others have less. One thing, interestingly, that didn't come up last year, at least it's not here, on the lecture slides. By the way, the lecture slides of last year can also be found in the forum, such as these will be made available, was will and willpower. Though I would say that this is actually one of the most fundamental aspects of my consciousness. The desire to actually influence the world, which causes me to behave in a specific way, to change my attention to specific topics, to set goals, to motivate myself, and thus actually to create my character as it is then perceived by the others. So these are some ideas of what consciousness might be. Of course, the whole seminar is on the topic, and there is a seminar task for laying out and comparing the most important models. But I want to give you another piece of input, and that is the, in my opinion, currently best description of what consciousness might actually be, and that is the model of Geller and Manzotti. I said it a couple of times. You find the link to their papers and their books also in the Tubal Forum, and the book in particular is also available from the library of the TOE. Okay, and this model I will enhance with my own ideas, because in particular the way we execute will, I think, is not very detailed described in this model. So what they say actually is that artificial consciousness is a system consisting of certain requirements. The first one, the name is environmental coupling. That means that we live in an environment of other people, of various stimuli, various different inputs, and interact with those. Interaction is twofold. The one is the simple reaction on what is happening now, and the second one is this long-term aggregation of knowledge in the memory, in the different sorts of memories that we have in the brain. Okay. most important for Jella and Manzotti is the aspect of autonomy. And that for them goes along with resilience. Resilience is the ability of my character to defend itself against others and to thus create a sort of stability in my character, in my being. For that, I have to be reflexive. I have to observe myself. I have to develop myself further. And autonomy means also that I'm able to make use of what I actually already learned, be a little bit distant from what I learned apparently, but also being able to employ it and believing in what I am and what I do. Another very important aspect for them is information aggregation. Plus semantics. The way I understood their works is that for them, the semantic enrichment is something symbol-based, something language-based, so the meaning, the way we describe what we know about the world in the media that we have, mostly in written form. And aggregation means that incoming different senses are actually filled into a bigger picture, and different types of sources are used in order to come to a conclusion about a certain active problem. Okay, for them, another one of the most important aspects is so-called phenomenal experience. This is a point in which I believe all models currently completely agree, because without output stimulation, without a connection to the world, it would not be possible to interact and to be individual. Another aspect is attention, which we referred to before as awareness, and self-motivation. Okay. So these are the components I found in their model in the literature, which define artificial consciousness. Two things that I would like to add are the inner monitor as a function. If we see what we have here in the model as requirements for the presence of artificial or consciousness at all, then the inner monitor is apparently connected to the attention side. It is also, since autonomy requires reflexiveness, connected here. And it is also connected to the environmental coupling. Yeah. So that's one aspect. Another one is, in my opinion, that is missing is the execution of will and creativity. Okay, let's have a look at creativity first. Creativity is certainly connected to information aggregation and also to the coupling of the environment, which is again coupled to phenomenal experience. And creativity I understand as being able to react to the outside world and actually produce a solution, a procedure as a reaction to what is going on outside. And I believe that creativity and willpower are closely related, and that brings us into the last part of this little excursion on artificial consciousness, because I believe that this is actually a source filter model that would at least be easy to describe. So what do I mean by that? I think that we have a flow of information in the brain. Well, that's not just what I think, that I think is well established. We have coming in what we perceive and what has been statistically aggregated. And thus semantically enriched, reaching eventually the cortex and the later stages of the cortex. These things are done, as we said, by comparing to the memory that we have. From that, we must derive how we react to the world, by interaction through speech, for example, or by motor interaction as well. And that we do by, in my opinion, taking this broadband input stream that comes in and laying it over the neurons in the subcortical regions, which are heavily connected among each other as well, and might be prototypes of behavior. At least I found such ideas in the literature. So the perceptual load comes in there, and there might be layers that actually recombine that, semantically enrich them, into the direction of creative behavior. Of course, creative in the widest sense, not creative as something completely new, intriguing as we have it in art, but mostly creative in the sense of some reaction. So not creative in an artistic way, but only that the different alternatives for the input signal are enumerated, listed, and sometimes something odd might also be added. That I would see as the creativity step. Always in conjunction, of course, with the inner monitor, so that these ideas are also kind of elaborated. So, if all of them are firing at the same time, because all these ideas have been generated at the same time, we need a kind of filtering for the actual behavior. Behind that stands the whole motor complex with the motor cortex, as we said, the central pattern generators, and the nerve connections to the actual muscles. Between that, as I think, stands the willpower block, and the willpower block is probably one that compares what is suggested to what we have before as the social norms. The intriguing part of it is that this can easily be implemented with standard neurons. Meaning that what I have here as prototypes developed in the subcortical regions could easily be semantically enriched by comparing it to the social norms, very late, of course, because on a very high semantic level already, and giving as output that behavior that actually goes beyond the threshold, the kind of winner-takes-it-all strategy, which could easily be implemented by connecting the different filters for different ideas with inhibitory connections. Thus, creating a strong filter boundary between the idea generator, which depends on the input given, following the path through the brain before we hit the motor side, where we let through only that behavior that has actually been admitted and set free by the willpower component, which would be an important part of the artificial consciousness. Motor then means to execute all the procedures necessary for generating certain speech patterns, certain words, and so on. Okay, to sum that up, we believe that artificial consciousness is a sum of individual components, including attention, resilience, experience, self-motivation. To the standard models that we have, we would like to add creativity as reacting on the inputs, strongly combining those, developing different hypotheses of how we could react to the situation that we saw on the inner monitor, plus a filter, the actual willpower, where neurons connected to each other, inhibitory to a degree, perform a processing step and filter out all those ideas that are not in line with the social norms, and then create the appropriate motor behavior, of course only in the mentally healthy individual. The mentally non-healthy or socially not adapted individual might not have the social norms or might also have a broken willpower layer.